Hey everyone, and welcome to this first lecture of the Christian Story 2 class. The focus of this class is to bring you through historical theology and wrestle with what people have believed at different times in the history of Christianity, what they've believed about the person of Jesus, what they've believed about the Bible, what they believe about God, and how these beliefs form and shape the different traditions that many of us are a part of. Now, some of you are Christians, some of you are not. So some of you won't identify with some of these traditions. But the point of the course is to kind of think through our belief in God and why do we believe the things that we believe. So if you're a Christian, thinking about what are the foundations of the beliefs that we have. Now, I want to make something very clear from the beginning. All of this is grounded on what you did in Christian Story 1. So reading the Bible is God's revelation, what the Bible says about who God is, all of those things. We will talk about the Bible, especially early on in this course, but and we'll bring up the Bible at different times to talk about some of the different perspectives. But we're going to spend most of our time kind of thinking about how the Christian community began to make sense of who God is in Jesus and how they interpreted it for their own context. And so really, we're beginning with this question, why do we believe what we believe? And I've put two links in Blackboard for you to watch. And so if you could at this point pause this lecture and go and watch the two videos of Richard Dawkins, number one, it's an interview with him, and then Father Lazarus. Watch those two interviews or those two clips kind of back to back. And then you can come back to this lecture and we'll pick up from there. So I'm hoping that you went and did that and watched those videos because it's important for me to begin thinking about what we think about with something called social imaginary. Now, how do we make sense of this word social imaginary? And I have an analogy, I think, that could be helpful. So social imaginary is the way in which we imagine the world to be. We inhabit the world in a certain way, and our mind never really has to kind of think about the world that we inhabit. We just live it. We just do it. So let me give you an example. The game of baseball. Some of you like baseball, some of you don't. That's neither here nor there. But the game of baseball has its own social imaginary. There are rules, there are practices, and there are a lot of rules that people don't even know about until you really get into the game. About what constitutes an out or what happens if this happens. And what it does is it has its own social imaginary. So if you want to become a baseball player, you begin by learning how to play catch, learning about the baseball, learning the different mechanics of throwing and hitting, and there are different practices that can help you do this. And then you play the game, but you begin to learn some of the rules of the game. Now, by the time you get to be a major leaguer, the rules have become such a part of your understanding that you don't have to think about them. You don't have to stop and think about the mechanics of throwing and catching and hitting, but they're there. They're embedded within the practice of playing a baseball game. Now, if you can imagine what it would be like if somebody who had never played the game, never seen the game, all of a sudden is thrown out onto the ball field during the World Series and is told they had to pitch and hit and so on. And they have no understanding of the game. This is social imaginary. that baseball has within it a social imaginary. And you can even see how there's like imaginary things, imaginary lines, fair, foul, home run, infield, outfield, all of those things. A pitcher's mound, batter's box. And this is all part of the game. You could take any sport and do this, a football, basketball, volleyball, track. It doesn't matter. There's a sense in which we have a social imaginary that we inhabit. And what I want you to do is now take that from this conversation of baseball and imagine it now into the broader culture. And this includes religion. So what I want to suggest to you is the early Christians were interpreting the Bible for a particular social imaginary. That they saw the world a certain way, inhabited the world a certain way, and then interpreted the Bible and Jesus Christ in the context of that social imaginary. And the same thing happens today. So what are the differences, for example, between the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and many of our Protestant traditions? A big part of it is how they interpret the Bible and how they do their theology. And so I'm not trying to minimize the importance of biblical interpretation and so on. But what I want you to begin thinking about is that part of this is that undergirded social imaginary. Like, do we believe that the spiritual and the material world inhabit each other or can cross over? And if we do, that's going to set the stage for us to believe about angels and demons and so on and so forth. And we're going to see how social imaginary shifts from the ancient world into the medieval world and into the modern world. And it's going to help us better understand Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, even if you don't believe anything, atheists. All right. Now, my goal in this class is to present to you the Christian faith in a certain way. I'm a believer, believe Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. I go to church every Sunday. I'm a co-pastor of a church, so I believe. My goal, though, isn't to necessarily get you all to believe. My goal is to get you to examine what it is that you believe. So I'm not trying to force you into a cookie cutter, like here are all the things you have to believe, but to get you to ask questions about why you believe what you believe. So when we look at somebody like Richard Dawkins, and Father Lazarus, what we find is they inhabit two different social imaginaries. Dawkins has been shaped by the social imaginary of the Enlightenment and modern science. Father Lazarus, has been shaped by the social imaginary of an Eastern Orthodox Christian community. Now, what's interesting is, if I were to ask the question, if we were all together and I asked you the question, who do you most identify with and which worldview do you identify with? Most of you will, or some of you who are religious will want to say, well, I'm supposed to identify with Father Lazarus, but some of the stuff he's doing and talking about is just strange. And that's not my version of Christianity. And I'm not supposed to identify with Richard Dawkins, but yet there's a little bit of me that's like, yeah, that's more of the world that I inhabit. And so one of the things that we want to do as we begin talking about theology is to begin wrestling with these kind of building blocks of a social imaginary. So I always like to talk about Star Wars and talk about the difference between Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. So if you go back to the original Star Wars movie, you have them in the Millennium Falcon, and Ben Kenobi is trying to help Luke use the Force. And in doing that, Han Solo comes in and basically says, hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid. And Ben Kenobi has said, the Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. And so here you find two different social imaginaries. Now, I know by the end, when you get into the latest films, Han Solo becomes a believer and so on. But throughout the film, he is a representative of kind of a technological, you could almost say scientific perspective, that there's no like spirituality that is inhabiting the entire world, whereas Ben Kenobi, in talking about the Force, is more open. There's an openness here. And I think it's important for us to ask the question, are we more like Han Solo or Ben Kenobi? And that will then inform a little bit of our understanding of religion and how we make sense of faith and reality in a certain way. Now, why is it that I want to talk about this stuff? Well, there's a shift that's happening in our country, in the West, where people are leaving traditional forms of faith. They're abandoning institutionalized forms of religion. Now, why is this happening? One of the things that I want to suggest is it's happening because we're not paying attention to the social imaginary. Like, how does Christianity now make sense within a world of YouTube and TikTok? And you go back into the ancient world, they're writing on papyrus. How do we make sense of faith? And how does social imaginary play a role in this? So there's a guy named Charles Taylor. He wrote this big book called A Secular Age. And in that book, he tries to engage this idea of social imaginary. It's a 700-page book, and he's tracing the belief from the Reformation, Luther's time. And what he says is, at the time of the Reformation in the 1500s, you could not believe in God, which is a double negative, which means it was almost impossible to be an atheist. And they would build statues for atheists because they were like unicorns. People just didn't not believe in God. Till today, where belief in God not believing in God is much more acceptable. And what he wants to argue is there's been a shift in social imaginary that has taken place. Now, interestingly, Charles Taylor is a Heideggerian philosophically, but he's also a Roman Catholic. And so he's writing it from this Roman Catholic perspective and demonstrating how Protestantism itself becomes this new form of social imaginary that gives rise to the possibility of science and enlightenment and some of these things. And what he wants to talk about is the difference between a porous reality. Now, what does that mean? Think of a strainer. If you have the spiritual and the material, right? The spiritual above and the material below, and the line separating them has holes in it, it's porous. The spiritual will get through. It can come and it can engage this world. So what he argues is in ancient and medieval Christianity, you have a porous reality where, of course, the spirituality is engaged in this world. And what happens after the Reformation, his argument is the holes get plugged. And so you have what is called a buffered self. In other words, even if there's transcendence or there's spirituality or a God out there, we're stuck because we're dealing with the material reality of this world. So one way to think about this, in the ancient world, they used to make sacrifices to have a good crop. There was a sense in which the gods played an important role in farming and whether you had a good or bad crop. And today, what we do is we use genetically modified corn or whatever. We use science to help us and technology to help us get a better crop. That is one example of the difference between the porous reality and the buffered self. One is recognizing the spiritual engagement, and the other is recognizing these material kind of technological factors. And so what he's arguing is we move from a social imaginary grounded in radical transcendence, meaning there's a spiritual reality out there that then engages this world, to what he calls an immanent frame, meaning the door is shut. And now we're dealing with immanent kind of means the present, the materiality, and we're just engaging in that realm as we live our lives. One way to think about this is like many of the students at Northwestern, very few of them are theology majors. Most of them are going into nursing, engineering now, business, right? And these are all part of the realm of the immanent frame. We're more interested in those things. And the spirituality part becomes an add-on, which we'll talk about later. So thinking about the difference between the time of the 1500s, why does Luther put his 95 Theses on the door? This is the door at the Church of Wittenberg. Well, he does that because that's where everybody, it was like the bulletin board. Everybody went to church. So that's where they would see it. And now if you put something on the door of a church, people aren't going to see it. Some people just go to church online. So where do we actually get noticed or seen? TikTok, social media, whatever. It's a shift in culture and social imaginary. And this also helps us as we think about differences in, you could do this whole study on the differences in the way churches look. So this is an Eastern Orthodox church, and it's built in a way that is grounded in the social imaginary of a porous reality. We'll talk about icons at a later time, but icons are meant to be windows to a spiritual reality. So when you see a painting of John the Baptist or Mary, or you kiss it, you're not kissing the painting, you're kissing John the Baptist. So it's porous. The Catholic Church has a similar kind of porousness, although it's a little different. It's more Western, it's more orderly. And then you start moving into Protestant churches, and you get to the point where, our sanctuaries look like a place where you'd have a rock concert. That's not a bad thing, but reflects a different social imaginary. That's what I want you to start thinking about. So what Taylor talks about is that the sacred gets kind of shut off as you move from the 1500s to today, and you begin to focus on things within the immanent frame. And what are those things? Politics, economics, technology, science. It used to be that violence would happen over religious beliefs, and now they're happening over political beliefs. And so these things become significant. And here's where I would again reiterate, many students are not theology majors. You're majoring in a field within the immanent frame, mostly driven by economics, the desire to make money, capitalism, and so on. Now, what Taylor would argue is there's a hauntedness that takes place. There's a haunting of the sacred. We still feel like there's got to be something there. Something is missing. And this is where you get the religious showing up in a variety of ways. Rock concerts. I've been to a few metal shows in my life, and it's very liturgical. They have all the same actions. They put their fists in the air. They chant. They wear the same clothes. There's an outfit. There's a call and response. So, somebody on the stands would say, "Hey, Minneapolis, are you out there?" And then everybody replies, and there's this engagement. It's very church-like, this call and response that takes place at a metal show. And many people would argue they have their spiritual experiences at a rock concert. Liminal experiences. What do I mean by liminal? Liminal is this word that refers to this thin space between life and death. And why do people, jump off of cliffs with gliding suits? I mean, why do we do dangerous things? We do them because we want to feel something. And it's that movement, that risk that pushes us into a place where we begin to experience maybe a sense of the sacred. Why do people go on mission trips? Well, there's a sense that they want to feel meaningful. And so they're doing nursing because they need to be employable, but they want to do that. They want to use their nursing in missions or whatever. That's not a bad thing, but it's part of a different now social imaginary. In the medieval world, if you wanted to be religious, you went to a monastery, you became a monk, and you became a nun, and you studied theology and philosophy. Now, though, in our new kind of frame, we study economics, science, nursing, medicine, and then education. And then we want to take those and go out and use that as a form of spirituality. So what I want us to begin thinking about here, and this is what this lecture has been all about, is why do we study theology? Why do we make you take this course? Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take this course as a way of thinking about why you believe the things that you believe. I think it's important that we think about social imaginary. I think it's important that you think about why you hold certain beliefs about the Bible and Jesus and God. And again, those are important beliefs. And we'll talk about them. But maybe some of the beliefs we hold aren't necessarily because, it's the truth. Maybe some of the beliefs we hold come out of a social imaginary. And maybe we can better understand one another if we can understand that social imaginary. And so part of my goal in this class is to also then help us understand one another's traditions. So Catholic students, I want you to understand your Catholicism better. And Protestant students, I want you to understand Catholicism better. So you can see our Catholic brothers and sisters as brothers and sisters, and vice versa. So that we can understand Protestantism, so we can understand what it means to be Lutheran or Methodist or evangelical. And I think all of this is important for us as we think about what it is that we believe. So that is what social imaginary is about. Hopefully it made sense. And hopefully, as we keep going through this course, we'll keep coming back to that question, like, why do we believe the things that we believe? And we'll use it as a way to frame what some of the early Christians began to say about who Jesus is. But to do that, we need to talk about Platonic philosophy. I know this is not a philosophy class, but we can't really understand what's going on in some of these early Christian conversations, theological conversations, until we wrestle with Plato, Platonic philosophy, and eventually we'll have to talk about Aristotle. So Plato is up next. Thanks for watching.